This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, along with Warren Smith. We've got a lot of stories to get to, a lot of really interesting stories that kind of cover the gamut of what's happening in the culture. I want to start with something that hit on Friday of last week. I mean, that's one of the challenges of doing a weekend program. Sometimes things land on a Friday and you don't get to talk about them until almost a week later, which seems like an eternity. But on Tuesday of this past week, we did a Breakpoint commentary, which we'll link to at our website, breakpoint.org. But it has to do with a very important free speech decision that came out of the Eighth Circuit, having to do with a wonderful couple that I've known for a long time, consider just to be incredible examples of people of faith. And let me start here, Warren. We've talked about Jack Phillips. We've talked about Barronelle Stutzman. Now we're talking about Carl and Angel Larsen. These are all individuals that have found themselves in the media spotlight, have found themselves in court because of their Christian convictions, not being able to go along with demands on their conscience from progressive activists, particularly when it comes to the LGBT issues. And I want to say that all three of these folks, the Larsens are two folks, all four of these folks, yep, they don't fit the model at all of hateful, bigoted, religious people. I mean, these are some of the nicest people and loving people. The Larsens in particular have a open, hospitable lifestyle when it comes to their home, when it comes to their family. I mean, they're kind of one of those couples that as a young couple you kind of look at and go, how do they do all that? And how do they still do all that and still be nice? And that's the first thing that I want to say is the Larsens are wonderful people before we get into how important a decision this is.
Well, that's exactly right. And I got to give a little credit, John, and I know you would too, to ADF. They pick their clients very carefully. Barronelle Stutzman, Jack Phillips, and the Larsens, as you said, are just fantastic people and don't fit the mold. And they're great representatives of the point of view that we espouse here at the Colson Center. And in politics, they have an old saying, candidates matter. Well, I think when it comes to, representing biblical views in the public square, having the right spokespeople matters as well.
It does, but it also is true that you could be as nice as the Larsens and still find yourself, kind of on the wrong side of the culture.
That's right.
One of the things we've said, for the last several years around our editorial team is that we should be kind and gracious, but you can't be kind and gracious enough, and you certainly can't be winsome enough. That was one of the words that Chuck Colson really liked, and we believe it. I mean, you should be clever and you should be nice and kind, but you can be as nice and kind as you possibly can be, and if you're on the wrong side of history, quote unquote, then you're going to be on the wrong side of a lot of cultural forces. The interesting thing about the Larsen story, though, is a couple things. Number one is that this was what's called a pre-enforcement challenge. So the Larsens are videographers. They've really been involved in a lot of Christian causes, Christian conferences and organizations. They're really good at their job. But the state of Minnesota basically passed a bill saying, you have to convey messages that doesn't denigrate in any way LGBT couples. So it would have required them to serve same-sex couples' weddings, despite their beliefs that marriage is between a man and a woman. And also, they couldn't really say anything other than that it's the same. And the Larsens had a personal interest in telling stories to show the beauty of marriage, and so that would have forced him to do videos also showing the same sort of message when it comes to same-sex couples. So they issued, along again as you mentioned with ADF, this what's called a pre-enforcement challenge, suing the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. Because if they basically didn't comply, they would face hefty fines and jail time according to this law.
Yeah, and the lawsuit was actually filed, John, back in 2016, and there was some question as to whether the lawsuit was going to be able to go forward. And I think what you said earlier, the significant decision was that the Eighth Circuit said that it could go forward this week.
Yeah, it did, and they actually not only did that, but the other part of this decision, the Jack Phillips case, the baker in Denver, was argued by ADF along the lines that baking a cake, especially a wedding cake, includes endorsing messages. So therefore, it falls into the category of speech and should be protected by the First Amendment. And the court never actually even got to that. What the court did is basically rule that, the state of Colorado and the Colorado Civil Rights Commission in particular just mistreated Jack Phillips. And the evidence, of course, was overwhelming on a number of levels. First of all, comments that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission members had made about Jack Phillips, about his beliefs, likening to Nazis. And then also that there was inconsistency. Our friend Bill Jack had gone around a few weeks later and asked bakeries to bake cakes with anti-gay messages, and they all refused. He filed that to the Civil Rights Commission, and they just dismissed it out of hand. So it was a clear, inconsistency, and several of the Supreme Court justices in their opinions and in concurring opinions basically said, look, we can't even deal with the merits of this case just because Jack Phillips was treated so poorly on the basis of his religious belief. That's not what this particular judge in the Eighth Circuit issued. The decision issued here was clearly a free speech case. Now, of course, videos, motion pictures have long been considered to be part of First Amendment protections. But basically saying, look, not only do the Larsens have the right under the Constitution to not be forced to say what they want, the government doesn't have a compelling interest here. This was sweeping free speech language. As I said back on Tuesday on Breakpoint, usually when a judge issues a decision, I have to parse through it with the help of a legal scholar. This was remarkably clear, and it was the sort of sweeping language that we didn't get in the Jack Phillips case. Now, of course, it's not the Supreme Court, but it is the Eighth Circuit. And because it was so clearly ruled on the basis of constitutional rights, the Supreme Court is going to have to overturn this sort of constitutional language when it does go forward, if this thing is going to be reversed. I think that's really unlikely.
Yeah, well, I think that's right, though it is, I think, important to note, John, that the Eighth Circuit decision is certainly a win for the Larsens, but it looks like this case is not over. David French is speculating that this could go to the Supreme Court, and I just think that means that, folks like you and me and those of us at the Colson Center, but also everyone listening here needs to continue to follow this case and continue to be involved, because judges are people too, and the conversation in the public square really can affect these judicial decisions.
The guy that's writing the majority opinion here, Judge David Strauss, is a new appointee. He's part of the judicial remaking that we've seen just since the change in presidential administrations here, which also underscores another thing that we've been talking about, and that is that elections matter. We have heard that these courts, especially the circuit courts, are being remade by these judicial appointments by President Trump, and this is, it's a good first line of evidence that they have been. Not only did the Eighth Circuit then, rule here in the Larsens' favor, but again, the language is pretty striking. And I deal with that on a commentary on Tuesday on Breakpoint. So come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link there on the homepage. It says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to the Breakpoint commentary as well as some other articles on this important case that was decided last Friday having to do with Carl and Angel Larsen. You're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. And just before the break, I mentioned this idea that elections matter. And I wanted to talk about that, Warren, because at the Colson Center, we quote Chuck Colson a lot, in which he said that politics is downstream from culture. Now, I think that's almost always true. I don't think it's always true. I think you can look at times during history where politics led culture. And certainly what we mean by that is that politics isn't not a part of culture. It's just that usually politics is an effect, not a cause when it comes to cultural forces. Sometimes, what happens in the political square does lead culture. It's just a rare thing. But I bring this up because, there's this debate over praxis about whether Christians should be involved in long-term cultural change or whether we should, take up our political responsibilities. And, we've been saying here for the last couple months that one of the things I think the themes of Christian engagement in culture right now is we've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So we can't sit elections out. We can't, sit voting our conscience out around some of these things. And we're seeing kind of very real examples of how elections matter. Now, that sets the stage for another really interesting story. And it was on Wednesday that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights, which is now led by Roger Severino, announced that it was bringing the University of Vermont Medical Center to task for violating conscience rights of one of their nurses there, a Catholic nurse who had expressed her opposition to abortion, elective abortion, and was actually forced to participate. I mean, it's a crazy story. And if you come to breakpoint.org, we'll link to the story. But the nurse was not told the procedure was an abortion. When she walked into the room, the doctor who knew the nurse's position on abortion told the nurse, "Don't hate me." But the University of Vermont Medical Center, who, by the way, didn't perform abortions throughout most of its history, but several years ago changed that and also has a sort of penalty in place for people who don't participate. Well, the nurse objected. She feared that she would be fired, and so she was forced there to participate. Now, interesting story. She brought this complaint to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. And this is against federal law, by the way. What's called the Church Amendments basically protect the rights of medical professionals not to participate in abortions. But Roger Severino came down really, really hard on the University of Vermont Medical Center, basically demanding compliance within just a few months, lest they risk losing federal funding to this particular facility. The thing that struck me, Warren, is how dramatically different this U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is from the previous one.
Well, that's right. You can't imagine, I don't believe, Kathleen Sebelius taking the steps that Roger Severino took this past week. I mean, it was a notice of violation letter sent to the University of Vermont Medical Center, and it was done after, as you said, a thorough investigation. It's impossible for me to imagine that the previous administration wouldn't have just looked the other way. They would have just said, we got too many things to consider. We've got too many cases. We'll just look the other way on this one and go prosecute someone else. The fact that Roger Severino and the Department of Health and Human Services even chose to look into this case is something that is different than the previous administration would have done. And, of course, the fact that they came to the conclusion that they came to matters a great deal as well. It matters to this woman, this particular nurse, but it also, I think, probably serves notice to just about every other medical center on the planet that receives federal funds, or I should say at least in the United States that receive U.S. federal funds, that they should be very, very careful about guarding, protecting the rights of people who have conscious objections to abortion. And that's a good outcome, not just for this nurse, but for all health professionals all over the country.
Not only would the last HHS under the previous administration, not take this claim seriously. We've seen two things. First of all, there's a huge uptick in the amount of complaints going to the Office of Civil Rights having to do with conscience. And it's almost like people think that this one will actually pay attention to the complaints. But the second thing that's worth saying is, remember, it was Kathleen Sebelius, it was the Office of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that gave us what's famously known as the HHS mandate. I mean, that was something that we talked about on Breakpoint and on Breakpoint This Week numerous times because of the violation of conscience that posed, basically requiring employers to provide contraception and abortion-inducing medication free to their employees, and with very, very few exceptions that wouldn't even cover nuns. So here you have the last group, and this is what I said on a Breakpoint commentary that came out on Friday. Essentially, you have the last administration, forcing nuns, and here you have this one freeing nurses. I mean, this is a very, very different HHS. And just like we talk about the remaking of the judiciary, we also need to mention, when it comes to these government agencies, these departments that are appointed, there's every single administration comes with, 3,000-4,000 other people who bring their own worldview. So worldview matters, and that's why elections matter. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Welcome back. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. I'm Warren Smith here with John Stonestreet. And you know, John, at the Colson Center, we've got a really exciting initiative that's going to be starting in the coming week. It's What Would You Say? It's a series of videos that have been put together over the past few months by our colleague and friend, Joseph Backholm. And it's going to answer a lot of really important questions. You know, a lot of us, families, friends, maybe even over this Labor Day holiday, are getting together with folks, and they're asking tough questions. And for those of us who have a Christian worldview, it's important that we have sort of short, sharp, crisp answers to some of those tough questions. And that's what these videos are designed to give to Christians, sort of these talking points to answer these hard questions.
Yeah, this is such an important, I think, project. A lot of Christians know kind of their positions when it comes to these really controversial issues, but maybe they don't know why. And maybe they don't know how to articulate it. And the fact of the matter is there's such a divide now, and the ability to articulate our deeply held convictions in a way that's memorable and usable and shareable, that's really what this project is all about. I'm super excited. The last thing that Chuck Colson talked about in his very last speech was what's called the spiral of silence. And I think that's what these videos are trying to address. Think if you could just get an answer, a memorable, repeatable, trustworthy answer to any question that you are posed from your kids, from your neighbors, from your family members, sitting across the table at holidays. Think if you could just articulate a solid Christian answer. That's what these videos are. Come to breakpoint.org and we'll link you to the What Would You Say launch, which is happening on Tuesday of next week, September the 3rd. We're super excited about that. Warren, I want to get to another story here that landed near the end of the week, and it created a lot of headlines. And one of the things that I noticed was that both sides of this debate immediately took it as proof for their position. And I think it's a little more complicated than that, but I think it absolutely undermined kind of the status quo, which is that there have been long considered a given biological determinations for a person's sexual orientation. But it was a massive new study. Basically, and the headline was, there's no gay gene, but there are genetic factors. And yeah, it was just a fascinating study that was picked up and carried, by many outlets, basically saying, well, the researchers conclude that there's not a single gay gene that produces sexual orientation, but, there's a lot of correlative genes and that sort of thing.
The study was published in the journal Science. That was kind of where it made its big splash. But as you said, media outlets all over the country have been picking it up. Hundreds of thousands of people looking at analyzed DNA to try to find the same-sex gene. Andrea Ganna, the lead author of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory Group and a leader at the Institute for Molecular Medicine in Finland, said the research said that same-sex behavior was a part of the natural diversity of our species.
Well, and I want to jump in on this because there were three things here that really kind of alarmed me on this study, and especially how some of the headlines were saying, this concluded that there were genetic factors behind sexual orientation. Here's the first one, is exactly what you're saying. The researchers kind of led with their set of assumptions, that we assume that same-sex behavior is part of the natural order. We assume that it's part of human identity, and there's nothing here that contradicts that. That's very, very different than saying that the findings of their study confirms that.
Well, that's exactly right. And of course, as Christians, we believe that we live in a fallen world, and that whether there's genetic evidence or markers, that may be a sign that there is a gay gene, or it may just be a sign that we live in a broken world.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And that's a whole nother kind of conversation. But in a report on the study in which they call Communication and Interpretation, here's where the researchers kind of lead with. The topic explored in this study is complex and intersects with sexuality, identity, attraction, and potentially has civil and political implications for sexual minority groups. Therefore, we've engaged with science communication teams. So in other words, not just science teams, but science communication teams. How do you articulate the findings of this? And also engaged with LGBTQIA+ advocacy groups nationally. What an interesting thing. How many scientific research studies engage with advocacy groups in how to communicate the findings of their study? And we wish to make clear, and this is kind of the punchline, that our results overwhelmingly point to the richness and diversity of human sexuality. Well, that was another kind of red flag in the study for me, is because they've equated completely, and you can kind of see this in the study, and we'll link to it at breakpoint.org. What they've seemed to equate to me is people who have had any sort of sexual experience that is same-sex and basically equated that with sexual orientation. I think that that would be a kind of a dramatic difference from those who would identify, those who would see this kind of as a lifelong pattern, and those that have had any sort of sexual experiments whatsoever. That was the other thing. Two other things, though, that I wanted to bring up, Warren, on this that I thought were really interesting. Under the results summary, and again, the punchline that was led is there's no gay gene, but there's lots of genetic factors. I want to read what the researchers themselves wrote. It's kind of hidden down in here, so let me read it out loud here. These aggregate genetic influences that influence same-sex behavior partly overlapped with those on a variety of other traits, including externalizing behaviors such as smoking, cannabis use, risk-taking, and the personality trait, quote, openness to experience. Really? I mean, it would seem then that sexual experimentation then could very much fall, and the reasoning for people to engage in same-sex sexual behavior could fall into, hey, they have a more genetic tendency to engage with risky behavior overall than necessarily creating what we now have come to call sexual orientation, something that we never question. It's as if it exists, even though it never existed in human history until yesterday.
Yeah, well, that's right. And the other thing, John, again, from a Christian point of view, is that God is real clear on what his highest and best plan for us is when it comes to sexuality. For some people, adhering to God's plan is going to be easier than for others, but it's the same plan for all of us.
And we're going to dig deeper on this study and probably talk about it on a Breakpoint commentary. One more thing that I want everyone to hear under the conclusion, kind of in what's called a structured abstract. It's kind of a larger abstract of the study overall. Researchers conclude many uncertainties remain to be explored, including, and I'm quoting here, how sociocultural influences on sexual preference might interact with genetic influences. So this is a way for the researchers to say it's not all nature. There's nothing we found here that said it's all nature. Interestingly enough, the LGBT movement advanced, really on that mantra, born this way, born this way, born this way. As I talked about in the book that I wrote alongside of Sean McDowell on the issue of same-sex marriage, you can go back to research back in the late 80s in which advocates are saying, look, we know that it's a mix of nature and nurture, but born this way will work, so let's use it. So there has been a wonderful PR campaign around the fact that there are genetic causes for, same-sex behavior, and if there are, therefore it makes this behavior morally acceptable and therefore, as the researchers put it, a normal part of the human experience. Yeah. The other thing we have to say, too, and I know we're getting into some weeds here, but this is the influence of Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey's research was used to promote if it's normal, therefore it's moral. Look, what's normal in some parts of the world is completely immoral. Why is it different rules when it comes to sexuality? What's normal in human experience in America right now is to do really stupid things on social media and to say really dumb things and evil things on Twitter. No one would say that's moral. Why do we take normal and make it moral when it comes to sexuality?
Well, I think that's a really great question. And, John, I'll have to say that at the end of the day, I welcome this study. I thought it was fascinating and interesting. I think it's opened up a lot of conversations. I think it's going to give Christians a lot of opportunities to talk with their family, friends, and neighbors about sexuality. And I think that it highlights, though, that we need to educate ourselves on this topic. We need to read your book on same-sex marriage. We need to read books like Christopher Yuan's book and Rosaria Butterfield's book. And, of course, most of all, we need to read Scripture and understand God's mind on these matters and be prepared to have these conversations, which I think this study will make more common in the days ahead.
Well, I hope that's the case. And I do want to say that's a good point, that I welcome the study as well. It just seemed to me that there was an awful lot of bending over backwards in the study and in the language of the study, and certainly in the headlines. The headlines that I saw in the reports, for example, on the Washington Post, did not, to me, reflect what the study itself was actually communicating in all the different aspects. So I just think that it's really important that we kind of dig deep on these things, and we'll try to do some more of that here, in the coming week. Last thing I want to just bring up is that we know that there is, even as we record here and as people will be listening to this program, a hurricane, it looks like, kind of leveling in on Central Florida. So we want to send our prayers to everyone. And, it's every time we talk about a disaster that hits really anywhere in the world, a huge headline, Warren, and you do such a great job of reminding us all of this, is that Christians are running into the disaster, not away from it. And so as Mr. Rogers told us, watch for the helpers, because they will be there. And by and large, a lot of them will be people of faith who believe that they should take their faith into their everyday life, and that includes helping those that are in need.
Amen. Yeah, amen to that. It's wonderful to see Baptist Men of Florida, Samaritan's Purse, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association's Rapid Response Team. They are already mobilizing and getting ready to help the folks in the path of Hurricane Dorian.
Thanks for listening to Breakpoint this week. I'm John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Don't forget the What Would You Say video project is launching early next week, so come to breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org. And we'll link you to information not only about that project and where you can sign up to receive notification for each and every video, which will be added each and every week to help you answer the really tough questions about your faith that you get in today's world, but also the other articles and resources on the other stories that we talked about on today's program. For Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us.